Good afternoon, everybody. Could I get everybody's attention? I think we'll be getting started with Dr. Luban's lecture in a bit. So just a quick introduction. I'm midshipman first class Artem Sherbinin, and I'll be introducing Dr. Luban here. I take part in the Stockdale seminars for the last 2 years with Dr. Luban. David Luban is a professor in law and philosophy at Georgetown University, and a class of 1984 distinguished visiting fellow here to the Stockdale Center. He has numerous publications and in the field of law, philosophy, human rights, and international law. So warm welcome to Dr. Luban.
Thanks. The subject of responding to atrocities is just perfect fare for people who are enjoying their lunch. But apart from that, enjoy your lunch. Look, civil wars can be exceptionally brutal. We know that. They are often viewed as correctly as existential struggles on both sides, especially for the leaders. During civil wars, neighbors take the occasion of the chaos that's going on around them to work off grudges against people they've disliked for a long time. The first person tried at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, the ICTY, was a karate instructor who was torturing people in camps who had beaten him in karate tournaments. People take the occasion to steal their neighbor's property. The rebels, maybe the state's own military that's fighting against the rebels, might not be a modern, disciplined military. They might not care about the law of armed conflict. They might not care about the jus in bello. Both the rebels and the states may think that terror tactics are their only chance of surviving. And of course, sometimes ethnic cleansing is part of the goal of the rebellion. So the question is, the conflict ends, how do you put Humpty Dumpty back together again? How do you put Humpty Dumpty back together again? People have to live with each other afterwards. Now it's a question that confronts the leaders of the new regime, whatever it is. Maybe it's the old regime if they won after the conflict. It's an issue for outsiders, outside interveners as well, the occupying force, if there is an occupying force, or in some cases for the United Nations or for the international community. It's been an issue for the United States. It was an issue in Bosnia. It's been an issue in the Middle East. Above all, it's an issue for the citizenry, for the people that actually have to live together with each other. There might be thousands of victims, and there might be thousands of perpetrators, and somehow they have to go forward. So here's a testimony from a woman who survived the Rwanda genocide. Her name was Laurentine Yabeza, and she says this: "A certain Giramahatsi is back, a man who beat me during the war with a stick, and from whom I received a machete blow also. The man threw me in a ditch after killing off my whole family. I was wounded. He's now at his house again. I saw him yesterday. I told him, 'Behold, I am risen from the dead.' And he asked my pardon. This man, who's responsible for his acts, lives now with all his family and gets his property back, while I remain alone, without a child, without a husband. As for pardon, if he can bring my children whom he killed and rebuild my house, maybe." Now, we ought to dwell for a moment on the dilemma that this woman is facing when she knows that this man is living just down the street. Now, tomorrow, Dan Philpott is going to talk about methods, possibilities of reconciliation between the people who have to live together in a post-conflict situation. What is the possibility of reconciliation in dire circumstances like that? What I want to talk about today is another path, and that is the path of the law, the path of criminal trials. If not for all of the Giramohatsis who are out there, which is not possible, at least for the leaders, the organizers, the people that we're now used to calling conflict entrepreneurs. Now, the United States has had kind of a love-hate relationship with post-conflict trials over the years. Of course, it was the Nuremberg Trials were our idea. I mean, there's a kind of creation myth. It's really it's a creation fact about the Nuremberg Trials. The United States thought that it was really important to bring the Nazi leadership to trial. Our allies did not necessarily agree. The UK, Britain, thought we don't want to give them a platform for them to try to rouse up a resistance. And anyway, there isn't any law to try them under. The legend has it that Stalin said, well, we just, first we, so the British wanted to shoot them. Stalin said, first we try them, then we shoot them. Stalin, this is what you get when you study the dialectical method extensively, kind of synthesis. At the Tehran conference in 1943, Stalin, supposedly in his cups, raised a toast to 50,000 dead German officers. Churchill kind of left the room in fury. Roosevelt kind of talked him into coming back. He was just kidding. Papa Joe said, I was just kidding. Well, he wasn't just kidding. The trials were our idea, and we thought that it would be important as not only for the point of view of justice, but from the point of view of getting the German people to understand exactly the enormity of what had happened. The United States backed the ICTY, the Yugoslav Tribunal, but there we were in a more ambivalent situation. Our occupying forces, NATO, peacekeepers, were not that thrilled when they're trying to get tensions to simmer down, get people to be able to live together again. We're not that thrilled at the idea of going in and making arrests because they thought that this was just going to cause everything to fall apart. There are reliable reports that when authorities were coming to arrest possible suspects for the ICTY, that NATO forces were warning them so that they could get away first. I remember at one point talking to the prosecutor of the ICTY, as a Canadian jurist named Louise Arbour, who said that when she wanted to go and interview witnesses, she would go out in a wig and a disguise, not because she thought that she was going to get bumped off by the hostile forces, but because she didn't want the NATO troops to know that she was going out to see the witnesses for fear that then they wouldn't be able to make the arrests. So, that's a little bit of ambivalence. In Sierra Leone, we backed the special court for Sierra Leone. It was a very fraught court. The first prosecutor was a former U.S. JAG and Defense Intelligence Agency official, David Crane, who did his prosecutions under some of the most amazing circumstances and probably exercised more prosecutorial power than any international prosecutor in history. All of the main suspects that he was after were at large, armed, dangerous warlords, some of them in the government. When he wanted to build a jail to keep them in, he had to do it under the guise of refurbishing a historic building. He crisscrossed the country both to get people to hear the voices of people who had been victims in the war and explain to them what the mission was, but also to build up a network of intelligence assets. It was absolutely crucial when he would get a call saying, we've heard that somebody is on the way to bump off one of your witnesses. He could call on one of his assets to provide a private plane so they could go and rescue the witness in time. He more or less negotiated an entire foreign policy going around to all the leaders in West Africa, saying just hypothetically, what would you think if we went after Charles Taylor? It was just an amazing piece of prosecutorial activism, and it had at least a half-hearted backing of the United States, although eventually David had to come back and lobby Congress to try to dislodge Charles Taylor from his refuge in Nigeria, which he succeeded in doing. It was a very successful court. It actually finished up all of its work. We are not big fans, as you have, I don't think is a secret to anybody, for the International Criminal Court for a number of reasons. Now, fundamentally, when you think about using the legal process in a post-conflict situation, you confront a peace versus justice dilemma. On the one hand, let's make the case against courts first. Trials stir up trouble. They could lead to a kind of endless cycle of vengeance and vendettas and recriminations. They're not about reconciliation. They are basically about retribution. In many cases, the trials might be the trials of the defeated by the victors who aren't going to put their own forces on trial. This was clearly the case at Nuremberg and at Tokyo. In some cases, like post-genocide Rwanda, a trial would be unthinkable because in a country of 7 million people, up to 1 million were perpetrators of the genocide. There were 100,000 literally physically rotting away in prison camps at the end of the genocide, and the idea that of putting close to 10% of your population in prison, just imagine, scale it up to the United States, we would be talking about putting 32 million people in prison. So there, something other than trials would have to be the route. Finally, I think the last case against the criminal process is that if leaders know that they are facing trial and imprisonment, then where's their incentive to step down? Where's their incentive to stop the fighting? So there are very strong reasons for avoiding the legal process. Maybe the right answer is what some of the post-communist states did, what Spain did, which is just to try to close the books, go forward, draw a line under the conflict, and have an amnesty, maybe have a truth commission, maybe a truth and reconciliation commission, which has ceremonies of apology and forgiveness. Now, that's the one hand. On the other hand, if there are no trials or punishments, then fundamentally you're saying that the bad guys got away with it. There's a certain disrespect for the human dignity of the victims. There's disrespect for the woman whose family has been killed by the guy half a mile down the road. It would be as if there were a murder committed in an American town, and everybody, the authorities, everybody else said, oh, we're just going to draw a line under it. Don't think about the past. Let's just go forward. For the family of the victims, for the survivors, this would be like saying, you just don't matter at all. Your suffering doesn't matter at all. There might be no closure for those victims. What's it like to be that person? There may be vigilante justice. And finally, if there's no trials, no criminal process, then the very value of law itself is diminished. You can't really say in this post-conflict society we respect the rule of law, except for dealing with the entire past. Now, I don't think that post-conflict trials are right in all situations and in all countries, and there might be very difficult compromises to negotiate. We're seeing one right now in Colombia, where there's been a general amnesty for the lower down FARC fighters. There is no amnesty for those leaders who committed atrocity crimes or led in atrocity crimes. But we know that there was enough hostility in Colombia against the idea of just having a pure reconciliation process that the first peace deal was voted down. The second peace deal was rammed through by the government without putting it to a popular referendum. But right now, there are going to be possibly trials, possibly reconciliation, possibly community service, and the country is trying very hard to find its way forward. I want to make a case on behalf of post-conflict trials. Once again, knowing that Dan Philpott will be here tomorrow to make the case for post-conflict reconciliation instead of trials. And my case is going to be a little bit unusual because I think that these trials have functions that are different from ordinary domestic criminal trials and that aren't fully appreciated, and I want to talk about those. So let's just start thinking about what the aims of criminal justice systems are in a well-run, peaceful domestic society. Basically, the aim is straightforward. We want to enforce the law. The way that we enforce those laws that are really important, really central to us, is that we attach criminal punishment to their violation. And that always raises a philosophical question. What's the point of punishment? What's the point of inflicting pain on somebody? You're just adding to the pain that their own deed has already caused. And the standard answers are well known. Retribution. They did wrong. They have it coming to them, which is importantly different from revenge because retribution is measured and it's done dispassionately when it's done right and it's done by a third party. There is deterrence of future crime. There is incapacitation of dangerous individuals. Hopefully, there is a rehabilitative function to being imprisoned. I mean, it's something that in this country we've largely given up on. Congress has officially said that we don't think that rehabilitation is a goal of our criminal justice system any longer. It ought to be. But at least there's that possibility. And then there's a fifth, which is upholding the law from the point of view of all the people who want to obey it. This is a more subtle point. I mean, when we think about deterrence, we generally think we use the threat of incarceration, the threat of punishment, in order to get people who would be lawbreakers to behave. But what about those of us who don't want to be lawbreakers? Now, you know, it's just a few days after April 15th. I'm one of those people who shares Oliver Wendell Holmes's minority view, namely, I like paying taxes because Holmes said it's the price we pay for civilization. There are a few other people like me around. What I would not like would be the idea that I'm the only chump who's paying taxes. So the reason that I want the IRS to enforce the tax laws is so that I can do what I would want to do anyway and obey the law without being made a fool of, without being taken advantage of, without being made a chump. So in the language of game theory, we're in an assurance game where people would like to comply, but they need assurance that other people will comply as well, and that's a reason for enforcing the law. Now, when we turn from those familiar theories of punishment, to the post-conflict trials, we find other values that are coming into play, and those are what I want to talk about. Now, you might think, first of all, well, which of these is the right theory of punishment? It's an important philosophical question. The lawyers are much more kind of cavalier about it. If you look at sentencing statutes all over the world, you'll find that they say, oh, our goals are retribution and deterrence and incapacitation and rehabilitation and so on. In post-conflict situations, the values become slightly different. First of all, let's focus on the incapacitation part. It turns out to be incredibly important to incapacitate the conflict entrepreneurs. the toxic leaders. It was really important to get Slobodan Milosevic out of circulation. The indictment of the ICTY against Radovan Karadzic kept him from coming to disrupt the Dayton Peace Accords while they were being negotiated. And this incapacitation function isn't just true for those people who are arrested and taken out of circulation that way. It's also true for those who are forced underground, who become fugitives. So we know that what happened to Karadzic was that his network of friends and allies protected him. He eventually changed his name, grew an extravagant beard, and became a kind of popular radio shrink. Until he was finally caught. But in the meantime, for 13 years of being a fugitive, he was kept out of former Yugoslav and Bosnian politics. And that's a form of incapacitation that turns out, I think, to be really important. Now, that's not the main difference between the values of criminal justice in post-conflict and ordinary domestic societies. I want to focus on a different one, and that's the issue of truth. And here I'm talking about two kinds of truth: factual truth about what happened and moral truth about how we label what happened. One of the most important functions of post-conflict trials is creating an authenticated forensic record of what actually happened. In other words, the factual truth about the crimes. Now, when we think about the domestic legal system, we oftentimes say a criminal trial is a search for truth. And it kind of is in certain restricted ways. But what's the value that truth plays there? Oftentimes it's not that we want history to show that this guy shoplifted 5 bottles of herbal essence shampoo from a 7-Eleven. The reason we want the truth is because if he didn't do it, he shouldn't be convicted of shoplifting. And if he did do it, maybe he should be convicted of shoplifting. In other words, in the domestic criminal process, the search for truth has an instrumental value, and what it's instrumental toward is fairness. Unearthing the truth isn't a value in itself. In post-conflict situations, finding the truth has an independent value. And let's see why. Civil wars are often caused by the toxic waste that is identity politics. Identity politics reaches a certain point, it spills its toxic waste into the society to a sufficiently bad level that a civil war breaks out. Tribalism becomes a kind of cancer that begins to destroy the society. Now, we all know that tribalism is the enemy of truth. People believe the facts that go along with their tribe's narrative. They reject the facts that go along with the other tribe's narratives. It's as simple as that. Nietzsche once said, my memory tells me I did it. My pride tells me I didn't. Eventually, memory gives way. So pride in my identity means my people didn't do it. And it doesn't take long before the denialists are at work, spinning and falsifying, rewriting history according to their tribe's own favorite mythology. So I see one of the crucial functions of post-conflict trials as the fight against denialism. Now, a natural question, I think, that comes up is what's so bad about denialism? Why is the truth so important? And I can see I want to suggest 4 powerful reasons why fighting denialism matters. First of all is the simplest. We owe it to the victims. The people that were murdered shouldn't simply disappear into a black hole. The rape victims who've suffered an injury shouldn't have heaped on top of it the insult of denial that anything like it had ever happened. It becomes a kind of, denialism becomes a kind of gaslighting of the victims. Well, you say this happened, it didn't really happen. the way that you say it is, and the people around them are undermining their sense of the reality of their own terrible experiences. Second is that if we really mean it, and I think we don't always, when we say never again about genocides or crimes against humanity or other atrocities, then we actually need to know that the atrocities happened. We need to know it even if it's our own side that committed them. You know, there's the Santayana old saw that those who won't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. You know, I think the saw itself is something that we're doomed to hear repeated again and again. But for that old saw, there has to be a history there to learn from, or else we'll repeat it. And that takes me to the third reason to fight denialism, that denialism is the first step toward resurrecting the toxic political ideology and making it something that's safe again. You know, the public opinion polls in contemporary Russia show that a somewhat larger than 50% majority are now Stalin fans. And there's a lot of history there that's obviously gotten to be suppressed and denied to become a Stalin fan. And the fourth is something that I actually don't know why this is true. That is, to me, this is almost like rock bottom. Truth matters. Truth has a value in itself. If we don't treasure truth and try to guard it, no matter how uncomfortable that truth is, then we lose that common sense that there's an objective, factual world that we all share. Now, there are a couple of problems with trying to attain truth through trials. First, courts of law aren't necessarily so good at it. Judges will tell you, I can't recite the historical truth because I'm limited to the case that the prosecution presents and the case that the defense presents. Both of them are choosing their witnesses, choosing their facts to support a certain narrative, their theory of the case that they've constructed, and they're not necessarily interested in getting the whole truth out there. They each have a certain selective truth and are marshaling evidence to support that selective truth. I don't mean they're falsifying evidence. I mean that they're culling it, they're choosing it. Courts can't see all the evidence in front of them as well because not all of the evidence is admissible. If the chain of custody in a piece of evidence has been broken badly enough, it can't be admitted even if it's valid, even if a historian would say, well, it's good enough to write history. Witnesses might end up being murdered or intimidated into silence. In some cases, especially rape cases, what we've seen in the tribunals is that victims are ashamed to say what actually happened to them. In Rwanda, women who had been raped just didn't want to actually describe what had happened because decent people don't talk about those things, and the defense lawyers exploited that fact to make it seem as if they were simply falsifying the event because they wouldn't answer the question, what did he do to you then? In other cases, lawyers will browbeat the witnesses and take it as an occasion to humiliate them in order to discredit them. There was a famous case in Canada of a Holocaust denier named Zundel. Canada has anti-hate speech laws that allowed him to be brought to a court of law. He had a very aggressive lawyer, a man named Doug Christie. Doug Christie just brutalized the opposing witnesses. A Holocaust survivor would be there, and he would ask, well, you didn't actually see your parents being shot, did you? Well, no. They took them behind the barn, and I heard the guns, and they never came back. Well, maybe they just didn't want to have you around anymore. Maybe they just didn't want you to, maybe they just didn't want you as their child anymore. Have you ever thought of that? A Holocaust historian gets on the stand and Douglas Christie says, well, everything that you say is hearsay, right? Well, yeah, that's called history. History is hearsay. There are transcripts with Doug Christie standing very, very close to a witness, looming over them. The other side saying, Your Honor, will you please instruct Mr. Christie to stand back from the witness? And Christie saying, are you going to treat me like a wild animal that's threatening this person? Well, he was a wild animal who was threatening the person. So that happens. Milosevic did this masterfully during his trial in front of the ICTY. So the court of law is a very imperfect instrument of truth-finding. It constructs forensic truth. It doesn't construct historical truth. But even more important, and these are arguments against the case that I'm making, if the idea is to fight denialism, sometimes it doesn't work. So there have been public opinion polls in former Yugoslavia for decades. 80% of Serbs think that the ICTY trials of Serbian defendants were unfair and that their results are not credible. So just think about this. 80% think the results aren't credible. A third of Serbs don't believe that the Srebrenica massacre of 7,000 Muslims ever happened. And among the Bosnian Serbs who are geographically closest to Srebrenica, only 10% believe it. 8% think that the entire thing was fictitious and dreamed up by the Americans. There's similar findings in Croatia, and basically this is identity politics at its worst. The Croats dislike the ICTY because they think the ICTY is biased against Croats. The Serbs don't like it because they think that it's biased against Serbs. And there have been a kind of theatrical moments. Many of you may have seen that the last year, the ICTY wound up its business, and on the very last day of that tribunal, a Croatian general named Slobodan Proljak stood up to receive the word from the appellate court. It upheld his conviction, his sentence of 20 years. He shouted, "Slobodan Proljak is not a war criminal," pulled a bottle out of his coat pocket, drank it. He said, "I've just poisoned myself." It was cyanide, and died a couple of hours later. This is something that, if you, it's available on YouTube, the suicide of Slobodan Proljak. So when identity is so much tied up with the sense of victimization narratives, then it's very difficult to fight denialism. So here's the unwelcome conclusion. Not only might criminal law not be such a great instrument of historical reconstruction, not only might it not be an instrument of reconciliation, it isn't even likely to fight local denialism. So why do it then? And here I want to give two reasons why we do it anyway. First of all, even if the denialism prevails over truth in the post-conflict society, it's really important to fight denialism in the rest of the world. Even if the Bosnian Serbs deny that there was a Srebrenica massacre, as apparently they still do in large numbers today, the rest of the world knows that there's a Srebrenica massacre. If you Google Srebrenica genocide, you get 800,000 entries popping up. And without the trials, we wouldn't know about it. And that takes me to the last reason that I want to talk about, and I think this is the hardest for us to get our minds around. Without the impetus of potential criminal trials, the information that we have would never have turned up. At Nuremberg, tons of documents were brought, collected by the Allies, and turned over to the tribunal. And had they not been turned over to the tribunal for trial purposes, they would probably have been destroyed, scattered, lost. The entire first generation of Holocaust historians used very little except for the information that had been gathered by the Nuremberg tribunal. In former Yugoslavia, a lawyer named Sharif Bassioni headed a UN commission to go and get witness affidavits. throughout former Yugoslavia while the war was still going on. It's clear that people would not have wanted to give affidavits about what happened out of intimidation, or in the case of the women who had been raped, in many cases out of shame, without the prospect of the tribunal. So it was the prospect that there would be justice and there would be accountability that elicited so much of what we know now. Fundamentally, that's the reason that the witnesses talk, and that's the reason that people put the energy into gathering the evidence. Let me give a contemporary example. That right now, there is an official UN body investigating what's going on in Syria. It's mostly interested in the poison gas. There is also a nonprofit, a private organization. This is the Syrian Commission for International Justice and Accountability. It's run by a Canadian war crimes investigator named Bill Wiley, by an American prosecutor, Chris Engels, and former ambassador, our global ambassador on criminal justice, Steve Rapp. They've been collecting hundreds of thousands of documents from Syria. How do they get the documents? Well, people risk their lives to smuggle the documents out. Many of you know the Caesar photographs. Caesar was a Syrian police photographer, forensic photographer, and the Assad government asked him if he would photograph all the corpses of the people that they had executed, because Assad wanted to make sure that the executions had been carried out. And Caesar eventually became so repelled, he defected and brought with him 50,000 photos of 5,000 identifiable and identified victims of Assad's assassinations. Another man, a man named Barakat, became kind of a mole within the Assad government and smuggled out the signed execution warrants signed by Assad of those victims, so that right now this Syrian Accountability Commission has stored in a European city whose name they will not divulge for fear that it might be burgled or attacked, probably the strongest trove of evidence tying a leader to horrific atrocities that we've had since Nuremberg. And my point is that none of that would exist. People would not be risking their lives smuggling documents across the border if it weren't for the promise of accountability. So the paradox here is this. In normal trials, the reason we gather evidence is to have the trial. Here I'm suggesting that one reason for having the post-conflict trials is to gather the evidence, to make sure that the history is not lost. Now, that may sound perverse or even upside down, but in fact, I think that it tells us a lot about our ordinary gut-level sense of justice. If people are willing to risk their lives to smuggle these documents out in the hope of accountability, surely that says something about how much the sense of justice matters to us. And I want to suggest that no matter what the outcomes of the trials are, that trove of evidence, some scholars talk about the terabytes of evidence we have about what happened in Rwanda. If it's carefully preserved, it keeps paying dividends to truth into the future. It's the basis for future history. Why do we care about that? Because we care about reality. You know, this one of my favorite sayings of Oliver Wendell Holmes is, I don't much believe in what is, but I believe a damn sight less in what isn't. Facts matter, truth matters, history matters, reality matters. Tim, thanks. Do we have time for questions?
About 5 minutes.
Okay.
Questions?
Thank you, David. So one of the most standard, I think, compelling piece about these trials is selective prosecution.
Right.
And I was wondering if you could muse a bit about that, because just the type of argument you're making seems like it would position you well
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I've worried about a great deal. I mean, is selective prosecution worse than no prosecution at all? Or is it better than no prosecution at all? Because the kinds of events that I'm talking about, momentous ruptures in a nation's history, in the world history, matter so much, I think that anything that helps to bring the truth out, as long as it's done in an internally, procedurally fair way, is worth doing. Now, politically, it's really important that there not be selective prosecution. I think that one of the things that's been a real problem with the Rwanda tribunal is that the Rwandan government simply won't turn over any evidence about crimes that the Rwanda Patriotic Front committed, even though we now have pretty good reason to think that they did commit some crimes, nothing on the magnitude of the genocide. But there's something wrong about going after just one side. This has been a problem that I think has dogged the International Criminal Court as well. Some of the states that have referred themselves to the ICC because of, the leaders are using it, knowing that they can control the flow of evidence so that their political adversaries are prosecuted, but they aren't prosecuted. And that's a problem. I nevertheless think that even if the prosecution has to be selective, as long as the court isn't trying to make it selective, as long as it's trying to be even-handed and examine entire situations, not just the crimes of one side, that it's worth doing.
Thank you, David. You used the word in your talk, denialism.
Yes.
Deny the truth, you assert the truth. Now, it seems to me that that would apply only to special large-scale cases of genocide and massacres, where other instances, like the one you opened up with, the story of the woman who's native to children, we have a much more complicated issue here, because it's not going to be a matter of saying, I didn't do it, and saying, I didn't do it, you really didn't do it. You may say, I did do it, but there were extenuating circumstances. I did do it, but they were in the I did do it, but they deserved it. I did do it, but they had no choice. So it seems that if you get, is there a scale here? Are you concerned mostly with a large scale genocide? Actually, you see where it's psychology of using trials all the way up and down this line.
Yeah. Right. So I'm talking about post-conflict situations in which I'm going to assume that atrocities have been committed either during the conflict itself or maybe by the regime for years or decades before it was overthrown. So I'm talking about coming to terms with large-scale violence. Now, I think that what makes sense is prosecuting leaders and conflict entrepreneurs. What doesn't make sense is prosecuting every perpetrator. As I mentioned, look, you couldn't do that in a situation like Rwanda's, where that would mean prosecuting maybe up to 1 out of every 7 people in the country. And what would be the point of a country imprisoning its population that way? So it might be that the best approach is something that combines criminal justice for the large-scale organizers and some kind of reconciliation and reparations mechanism for the lower-level foot soldiers, and for the in-between cases, prosecuting those who did particularly atrocious and cruel things, but in other cases, not. So, there's not denialism about what happened, what Gira Mahatsi did. Denialism is, as you said, in how it's characterized and how it's labeled. That was something I didn't emphasize just now in my talk, but I think that the truth in labeling is another really, really important function of the criminal process. In other words, that we don't call this a battle for the existence of the people against the adversary. We call it war crimes or crimes against humanity or genocide. Because we don't want the mythologization of certain kinds of political violence that it's in civilization's interest not to have happen again. So that's so what you're talking about is a kind of denialism that I think it's also important to fight.
I'm afraid we're out of time for questions.
Okay.
But Dr. Luban, we'd like to thank you for your talk and as a small token of our appreciation.
Thank you.
It's another cover of the USS Stockdale, so we hope you can bring something of the U.S. Navy over to Georgetown. So thank you very much.
I will do that. Thank you.